population the size of a modern city, families, children, elders, traveling through one of the harshest desert environments on Earth. No agriculture, no supply chains, no refrigeration, no stored grain reserves. And yet, according to the biblical account, they survived for 40 years. How? The story of manna is one of the most famous narratives in the Old Testament. But beyond faith, beyond symbolism, beyond tradition, there's a logistical question hiding in plain sight. How did millions of people eat every single day in the wilderness? Let's explore this, not as skeptics or believers, but as thinkers. The story appears primarily in the book of Exodus, and is later retold in the book of Numbers and book of Deuteronomy. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites enter the wilderness of Sinai. They begin to complain about hunger, and then comes the provision, manna, described as a fine, flake-like substance, appearing with the morning dew. Tastes like wafers made with honey. It must be gathered daily. If stored overnight, except before the Sabbath, it spoils. For 40 years, the text says, this was their daily bread. Now let's consider the numbers. The book of Exodus records 600,000 adult men leaving Egypt, not counting women and children. Scholars debate this number. Some suggest it reflects a literal census. Others argue the Hebrew word translated as thousand may have meant clan or unit, suggesting a smaller total population. But let's explore both scenarios. If the number was truly in the millions, the daily food requirement would be staggering. Modern estimates suggest an average adult requires roughly 2,000 calories per day. Multiply that by even 1 million people, and you're looking at 2 billion calories daily. For 40 years, that is not merely a miracle story. It is a logistical puzzle. Where would that quantity originate? Some naturalistic explanations have been proposed. In the Sinai region today, there exists a phenomenon involving tamarisk trees. Certain insects feed on the sap of these trees and excrete a sweet resinous substance. This substance crystallizes overnight and falls to the ground. It appears briefly in the morning before melting in the sun. Interestingly, local Bedouins call it manna. It is sweet, it is seasonal, and it resembles the biblical description in some ways. But here's the limitation. The quantity produced by this natural process is extremely small. It could feed small nomadic groups, but millions? For decades, unlikely. Another proposal suggests that manna might have been a type of lichen or a desert plant that blooms under specific conditions. Again, possible on a small scale. But the scale described in Exodus stretches natural explanation, which leads to an educational question. Was the number symbolic? Ancient texts often use numbers theologically rather than statistically. 40 years, for example, is a number associated with testing and transition throughout the Bible. 40 days of rain in the flood. 40 days of Moses on Mount Sinai. 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness. Is the number meant to communicate duration or transformation? If the population was smaller, perhaps tens of thousands rather than millions, the logistics become more plausible. Still difficult, but less mathematically overwhelming. Now let's think about desert survival from a modern perspective. The Sinai Peninsula is arid. Rainfall is minimal. Agriculture is nearly impossible without irrigation. Nomadic survival depends on livestock, goats, sheep, and access to oases. The Exodus account does mention livestock leaving Egypt with the people. Could animal herding have supplemented their diet? Milk, meat, trade with neighboring tribes? The biblical narrative emphasizes manna as primary sustenance, but that does not necessarily mean it was exclusive sustenance. Another educational layer involves food preservation and distribution. The text says each person gathered an omer per day, roughly 2 liters. That suggests organized measurement, structured collection, community regulation, no hoarding, no private stockpiling. The story, whether literal or symbolic, presents a society learning, dependence, and discipline. And that may be the deeper educational theme. In Egypt, food came from centralized storage, controlled by power. In the wilderness, food comes daily, enough for today, not tomorrow. Dependence replaces control. Now consider the psychological impact. Imagine waking up each morning not knowing where food would come from, yet trusting it would appear. For 40 years, that kind of narrative shapes identity, teaches reliance, it discourages accumulation, reinforces community equality. Everyone gathers the same measure. No one rich, no one poor. From a sociological standpoint, the Manna story promotes economic leveling, a daily reset. Let's return to the core logistical question. Could a miracle account be describing an event beyond natural law? For believers, yes. By definition, a miracle suspends ordinary constraints. But education requires us to distinguish between theological claim and historical reconstruction. The text itself frames manna as divine intervention. The question becomes, are we reading ancient theology as modern logistics? Or are we trying to extract logistical plausibility from a text primarily concerned with meaning? Interestingly, the narrative says manna ceased once the Israelites entered Canaan and began eating produce from the land. This transition suggests manna functioned during wilderness dependency, not permanent settlement. The story is geographically limited, purpose-driven. Now, let's zoom out. Ancient Near Eastern cultures often included divine food motifs. In Greek mythology, gods ate ambrosia. In Mesopotamian literature, deities provided sustenance during crises. Manna fits into a broader, ancient worldview where survival in extreme environments required divine favor. From an educational perspective, the Manna account teaches several key themes: environmental hardship, nomadic survival strategies, population logistics, ancient numerical symbolism, the psychology of scarcity, community regulation of resources, whether viewed as literal miracle, natural phenomenon amplified through memory, or theological storytelling. It reflects a real human anxiety. How do we survive when systems collapse? That question is timeless, and perhaps that is why the story endured. Today, we rely on global supply chains, trucks, ships, warehouses. But what happens when disruption occurs? The wilderness narrative reminds us how fragile food security can be, and how deeply survival shapes belief. So how did millions survive 40 years in the desert? The biblical answer? Divine provision. The naturalistic answer? Possibly smaller numbers, livestock support, limited natural phenomena, and symbolic storytelling. The educational answer? The text invites us to explore history, environment, sociology, and theology together. It challenges us to examine assumptions about numbers, about miracles, about survival, and about what ancient writers intended to communicate. Because sometimes the question is not just, did this happen exactly as described, but why was this story told this way? What does it reveal about human dependence, resilience, and community? If this documentary expanded how you think about one of the Bible's most famous miracles, take a moment to like this video. And if you enjoy thoughtful explorations that blend history, logic, and education, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because ancient stories often carry modern questions, and sometimes understanding the logistics helps us understand the meaning.